Welcome to Ecotopia U Media. I'm your host, Melissa McGinnis, joined by my co-host, the lovely Tom Wright. Tom, nice to see you.
Gee, thanks for the lovely.
We are on chapter 2 with one of our favorite guys, Conrad Mackerron. He's visiting with us via Skype today, and we're just thrilled to have him back.
Good to be back.
Conrad, thank you so much for being with us again today. It's really nice to see you.
Thanks, Melissa. It's a pleasure to be back.
So Conrad's kind of our go-to guy about packaging, right, and recycling?
Especially in the non-government, the NGO universe, and how they're putting leverage on corporations to be more responsible about packaging. Conrad's been the leading person at As You Sow on their consumer packaging and electronic waste initiatives. So, can you tell us a little about As You Sow as a nonprofit? Give us you're the executive vice president, or what's your actual title at As You Sow?
I'm senior vice president.
Senior vice president. Thank you.
As You Sow, and most of our work involves using our status as shareholders to engage companies on a variety of social and environmental issues. And so we come to a dialogue as shareholders using the leverage that we have as owners in the company to engage senior management. And so that's how we operate, is really by our leverage as shareholders.
And so, how did you get interested in packaging per se? What was your epiphany or your motivation?
Sure. About 10 years ago, I was doing research as an analyst on some portfolios for a socially responsible investor, and looked at the recycling rates for bottles and cans for the big beverage companies like Coke and Pepsi, and I was just blown away that it was so low, 20, 25, 30% rate for materials like aluminum and increasingly plastic that are quite valuable and in demand. And so it was a shock to me that anyone would put aluminum into a landfill. It's so valuable. So that started a multi-year engagement with Coke and Pepsi, which ended up in them making commitments to try to increase bottle and can recycling to 50 or 60% over the next few years. And so I began to look at the roots of this, and we've written a couple of reports about it.
So we were talking about how you mentioned Coke and Pepsi. You were had an integral role into getting them to commit to increasing recycling rates. In which way are they, or did they say that they were going to do this?
So they committed to a couple of different things. Coke said that they would try to collect 50% of all the bottles and cans that they put on the market. Pepsi and Nestle Waters took a different approach. They decided they would try to basically work with industry peers and get the whole industry rate, not just their own bottles and cans, but the whole industry rate up to 60% by 2018, I believe. Now, to do this, they need to really engage with a whole bunch of other sectors out there working on this, like government, other companies, trade associations, local and regional recycling industries, because there's so many different kinds of materials on the market that we have to deal with. Contamination now, that's a problem. We have to deal with education, inadequate education of consumers, and probably the biggest issue that we're finding out is a lot of communities cannot fully fund their curbside recycling programs. We know that almost a third of Americans don't have access to curbside recycling. They either have to take it to a pickup spot or a regional, what we used to call a landfill or a dump. And so there's still a lot of challenges just to get our infrastructure up to speed.
So there's many different issues on why and how to increase recycling rates. I mean, one of them, it seems like availability, and for me, I feel like a big missing link might be education on not just how to do it, but why it's so important to do it.
Right, and one of the big issues is, of course, that recycling is, the rules are local and they change. Where I work and where I live, there are different rules on what is taken between, say, Oakland and Berkeley. And so a lot of consumers, I think, are frustrated because they don't quite understand, or they can't be bothered to keep up with the changes and rules, and so we really have to do a much better job in this country of educating consumers about that. And part of that, I think, might be reflected in giving up a little bit on the restrictions and just encouraging them to put a lot of materials in the bin. But of course, if you do that, then you have increased contamination, and someone has to sort it out, the materials that can't be recycled. And so it is a difficult issue. In some societies, people are very willing to make 3 or 4 different separated batches of materials. In others, it seems to be just enough to be able to put it in one bin.
Do you have statistics on other countries' recycling rates? And if so, is there something that you feel that about their model that makes it work better? Go ahead.
Sure. Well, we know in Europe that Belgium is about 80% packaging recycling rate. Germany is about 71%. And of course, we think the reason this is happening is that it's mandated, whereas here there are no mandates, and that is, I think, the fundamental issue that has been part of a national debate in recent years. Germany all the European Union companies were required to meet mandated recycling rates set by the EU, and so everyone in Europe has been working towards meeting those goals. Here in the U.S., there may be cities and maybe states that have set up some recycling goals, but there are no mandated national goals, and I think that's a fundamental difference, is that we are on the voluntary system, try to do better. Europe has said, meet these goals or there will be penalties.
And would it be penalties to an individual, or penalties to, because I still don't see how you can, as a corporation, make someone recycle. So where do the penalties lie?
Well, the European system has a lot of moving parts to it because you've got 27 different countries, and so all of them have similar but somewhat differing policies, but some of them do have incentives for improved kinds of packaging by putting special taxes on hard to recycle materials. So if you've got a PET bottle, that's no problem, but if you have a PVC bottle, if you have a kind of a pouch material that is very difficult to recycle, there'll be extra fees placed on those, and so that's an incentive for companies to put more recyclable materials on the market.
That's a really, really great idea. That's a way to streamline and really, I guess, influence or try to get some type of compliance with something that's actually recyclable. I mean, we see so many issues here, like the green to-go container at Whole Foods, that plastic clamshell. You're saying because it's green, it's contaminated, it's already a clamshell, it's already difficult to recycle. Why do we keep coming up with new products that aren't that acceptable in our recycling system here in the U.S.?
Well, that's a terrific question, and it is the focus of a current debate going on in the solid waste and recycling industries about how much, really how much freedom we can afford at this point. If we really want to have strong competitive recycling rates, we may need to put some limits on the kinds of packaging that are out there. And but of course, any kind of limits on materials traditionally have been fought pretty aggressively by companies who want the freedom to innovate. But I think as you look across the entire life cycle, you have to look at end of life now increasingly. And as we know, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of focus on the circular economy. These aren't necessarily new ideas, but I'm very happy that they're getting some currency with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation and the work of Bill McDonough. But what they show companies is that they do have to pay attention more to the end of the life cycle more than just the beginning of the life cycle.
Yeah, it seems like the freedom to innovate is also the freedom to trash. And somehow there's a disconnect between the two phenomena, and it's kind of sad in a way because it's obvious to me, and I'm sure it is to you, that if you create something and it has no infrastructure for recovery, it will not get recovered. It will become trash. It'll become trash.
And it also needs a market.
Yes.
That's why we have so many complicated issues. We have the consumer education piece. We have the challenged infrastructure where we're not collecting things always in a clean manner, and so they get contaminated. And then we have the fact that you have volatile markets. And sometimes you are relying on what I would consider to be kind of quick and dirty alternatives, like shipping all these materials to China, which until a couple of years ago would take contaminated materials until they put up what was called the green fence, which you may have heard of, and now it's much harder to export those materials, forcing the domestic industry to
let's
do some
talk.
cleaning up.
If you don't mind, let's talk about this issue with China just for a minute, because I do think it's enlightening to the audience to kind of understand that the quote unquote the freedom to have markets, when the market becomes isolated, which in the case of China became the big market, especially for the Pacific Coast states. And then, as you put it, the Chinese finally, and this is, by the way, of course, connected to Bill McDonough's work. People who don't know who Bill McDonough is, the co-author of Cradle to Cradle, and he was actually raised in Hong Kong. And so, you know, he's been a professor at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, and he's got a lot of cred. And he's telling the Chinese government, well, you really don't want all this crap from the United States. Therefore, you want to design your products better, and they're listening to him. So the irony is that we're planning on the quote unquote this outlet, and they're planning on just the opposite. They're planning on not using us so much. Go ahead.
Now, there are some hopeful signs. You know, California has used some of the money from the deposit bill here, the deposit law, the unclaimed deposits, to develop more of a domestic infrastructure for PET plastic. So now we have, in the last couple of years, some new facilities partially financed by the state, so that there's an incentive to keep those bottles and the hard plastic in the state, and again, in hopefully what is a virtuous cycle of renewal.
By the way, that's the virtuous cycle. By the way, he's smiling there because that in Chinese, that's what it translates to. That's the actual phrase that the Chinese use. They talk about the virtuous cycle.
But it goes back to creating mandates on new innovative products. So that's ideal. That's an ideal scenario. That is if we're not introducing all these different plastics and different components into a stream. We need to really streamline it from all different avenues.
Back to this in-market, domestic in-market possibility. There are 10 deposit states. Do the 10 deposit states act totally different from the 40 non-deposit states in your mind? Is there a difference that you can see?
Well, we know from the results that they all have in common that they have dramatically higher recycling rates than the non-deposit states. It's about 70 to 80% collection rates versus 30% in the non-deposit states. So they're doing the heavy lifting, which is ironic because the bottlers like Coke and Pepsi don't like these. They consider them an unfair tax, and yet they are proven to be the most efficient way to recycle so far that we've devised in this country. And, you know, as part of my dialogue with the companies, I said, we'd love you to stop your opposition to bottle bills or come up with a plan B that's just as effective. And so for the last 5 or 6 years, we've tried to discuss with them producer responsibility as a possible alternative. That has not caught on, and now we're waiting to hear, you know, what other alternatives are there, because bottle bills are the only ones that have been demonstrated to have very high recycling rates across the board for those materials.
Now, you probably are familiar with the Washington Post article that came out a couple weeks ago.
Right.
And it basically announced that, in a sense, recycling doesn't work. How would you summarize your perspective of reading that article?
Well, I'm glad that the issue is getting high visibility, because often it doesn't get front page treatments. But I was a little concerned that it appeared that Waste Management was hyping the issue because of its own bottom line. They're a profit-making company, a publicly traded company, and yet they weren't really telling, I think, the whole perspective. And part of the concern is they were saying that the prices of materials are volatile and that they've been down, which is true, but this has always been the case. This is nothing new. And for them to portray this as such an urgent situation that they have to go back and renegotiate contracts with municipalities to get higher payments, to me, that didn't quite ring true, because they've been in this business a long time, and I think they know volatility is there. The other piece of it was that they were saying there's a lot of contamination that's coming from single stream recycling and that they have to put more people on it to clean this up. And that's true. And yet Waste Management was this company that has pushed single stream recycling over the last decade. Instead of having 2 or 3 carts, they want you to put all your recyclables in 1 cart. And so they have to deal with that because they were the ones who pushed it. So I have some sympathy with what they're saying, but I don't think you can jump to the conclusion that recycling is dead or broken because of that. It's just going through another challenging phase.
Well, let's talk a little bit to help the audience understand what single stream recycling is supposed to mean. Go ahead and explain that. Explain it to a 10-year-old person that you just met from another country. How would you explain it to them?
So all the things that your town says can be recycled, like paper bags, plastic bottles, aluminum cans, all those materials can be put into 1 bucket or 1 rolling cart and then sorted out later at what we call the materials recovery facility. That's single stream. All of the recyclables going into 1 stream or 1 box, as opposed to previously where you might put cans in 1 bucket and newspapers in another bucket, or anything that was wet in another bucket. But single stream unites all of that, mainly for reduced labor costs.
Now, in terms of material recovery, what are the issues with single stream? What? There is another side of this, which is go ahead.
So when you think about glass, it's very fragile. It gets broken, and once it contaminates, once it gets broken, it can contaminate all those materials in there. If you put empty cans that have, partial salad dressing, beer, whatever's in those bottles, and it gets mixed in with the newspaper, it can contaminate the paper. So these materials that were valuable when they were dry and separated can become problematic, and extra time is needed to collect and clean them on the other end when they after they are put into the material recovery facility.
So what are we to do? I'm just trying to get to some type of activation or some type of understanding just for an individual. What's the best in class or best practices if I were to want to recycle wholeheartedly? I really want to jump in and be a part of the solution. So what are we to do across the country? Because it's so different.
Yeah, that's a great way to. Is there any political clout for an across the country initiative? That maybe that's a side question to what she's asking you, and if not, what are we saying to each other? Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Unfortunately, I don't see that national will out there or a national identity. This has all been local, and it continues to be local. How waste is collected and processed, and EPA doesn't even have the authority under federal law to regulate recycling that much or solid waste. It's really delegated all that authority to the states and municipalities, and so you'd have to go in and change that. Now, there are some things that President Obama could do, or the administration, but he hasn't made it a priority, and none of the big companies have wanted to go that direction. And so you're looking at dealing at best with 50 states, at worst with 9,000 municipalities. And so I think, but to go back to your question, what can a consumer do? I think first thing is to just be very aware and very vigilant of how to recycle in your community, and to try to encourage your state and local government to improve how they communicate with people. That's one issue. I think the second is to encourage companies to begin to take some partial responsibility, which is what we do with them, is to say, this can't all be put on American taxpayers. There needs to be some at least shared responsibility for companies, and that's the kind of dialogue we've been having with companies. And if companies hear that through like the Make It Take It campaign, which is a new portal for concern about packaging, you as a consumer could go on to Make It Take It websites and talk to some of the big brands there with some of the sign-on letters they have. So those are a couple of constructive things that could be done.
So it's up to us to be vigilant and then share the information once you understand your local recycling community, go out and talk about it with your neighbors and really kind of, I guess, own or be a steward to what's really important, which is recycling. And then just lastly, because I know you've got to wrap, where do you see some of the trend in terms of packaging going? I mean, are we going to still continue to create virgin plastic over and over and over again, even though we know it's not being recycled and how terrible it is in terms of the environment?
Yeah, that's another great question, and it's another complicated one because this movement towards plastic, especially flexible plastic, part of it is being done with an environmental rationale that these pouches and flexible kinds of plastic do use fewer materials and have lower greenhouse gas emissions in the manufacturing side. But the problem is you haven't been looking at the whole life cycle, and once companies are pushed on the end of life, it changes the whole dynamic. And so I don't think we can turn back the clock, I think, to stop using this plastic recycling, but I think we can make it recyclable. We can force them to reformulate some of these packages that, as Bill McDonough calls, they're monstrous hybrids. You can make them out of one resin instead of 3 or 4 resins, make them simpler, and then they could be recycled, although that will take more expense and infrastructure, but I think it can be done if the companies do have the will to invest in it and promote it.
They're all interconnected, absolutely. Well, I think this conversation really demonstrates why your nonprofit is so important. And I really believe in what he's saying in reference to it has to be collaborative. You have to get all of these different entities in one room and become to understand the problem. And as consumers, we have to demand better practices.
Yeah, we need to give As You Sow more backbone as consumers, because in a way it's like As You Sow has this very honest and authentic perspective, and I feel like they get pushed aside as oh well, we let our government affairs people deal with them.
Yeah.
And it's not really taken as seriously as it should, and it's kind of sad, isn't it, Conrad? Just in that's
right. There's a long way to go, but I would just say in closing, there are some hopeful signs. The fact that brands have stepped up and funded the closed loop fund and the recycling partnership is a positive step forward.
Good to hear that.
Well, we just want to thank you for all of your hard work, and this is such a big topic, subject, very detailed. We'd like to catch up with you again soon.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Conrad. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
You know, it is kind of interesting, this whole idea about a lack of a national initiative in the United States. And when you think about some of the critiques in the articles there's been a lot about the recycling of materials doesn't work in America. And there's a couple things that seem to be missing from the conversation, and it's almost like we don't talk about these things, and it's kind of like they're taboo topics. But when you think about it, why are they taboo should be a question in our mind. One is, why isn't there a national initiative? You know, how PET could get recycled is pertinent to 50 states. It's pertinent to everybody.
Even if it's not an initiative on the recycling side, it should be a mandate on the manufacturing side.
Well, that's called extended producer responsibility.
But there should be mandates. We should be learning from other countries. It should be a priority. It blows my mind that there's not more thought going into that.
And it's very interesting that in terms of the other thing that you don't see a lot of discusses is the economics of why the material recovery market is slumping has a lot to do with the demands from China, from one country, which is acting as a single entity. When Conrad referred to the green fence, that was a national perspective from Chinese that at the port they were not going to, they stopped taking contaminated materials.
Right.
And so it created a signal to the market real fast, because there was all sorts of plastic and paper goods that built up at MRFs on the West Coast in particular, okay, where in other words, you literally had months worth of inventory building up. And it was almost too funny to go to these facilities back in March when it was at the peak of building it. What happened?
The light went out.
That's
the light
okay.
went out. Just makes me a little duller. Anyway, the point being is that it's the funny thing in talking about pricing about issues has a lot to do with the Chinese acting as a single entity, as a nation, and the Chinese having a perspective that slowed the market down. Now, having said that, I mentioned the part about McDonough, again, consulting with the Chinese market. They don't want to demand so much of our stuff anymore.
No.
And so why aren't we thinking as a nation state about our stuff creating jobs in America? I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, so I always find it funny that we even debate this stuff. I think we should think better as a nation state about how do we recover materials and create jobs. To me, it would be a great debate, or at least it'd be nice to hear that conversation.
And expand even the bottle bill. I think the big producers, the big manufacturers, we talked about Coke and Pepsi, how do they find a way to advertise and celebrate bringing your bottles back versus try to keep it at bay? Like, let's figure out a win-win for everybody.
Yeah, because I have a feeling they treat As You Sow like pat, pat, pat. You know, it's like the little kid.
Well,
you know?
thank God for somebody like Conrad. What I also appreciated was he didn't have any angst. He's not angry about the issues. He's just very transparent that these are issues, and let's work on solving them.
That's true.
All right, well, we're going to sign this one off. So thank you for setting that up. Conrad's a great guy, and we'll talk to you all again soon.